Oh, Tay. Hello. Wednesday office hour. Um, Starting a little early today, because I was just sort of, I've included the link for those in the chat for you go to Autonomous Collective, Autonomous Collective on YouTube, and you'll see what I had put up before. I was reading through the text that we're going to consider today. Um, I can just find the spot where it is. I will continue on. You can go to the earlier part by looking at the YouTube page. It's under the live segment, the live tab, I guess. So where we left off was at the beginning of Circulation and Turnover Time of Capital, Volume 1. Marx has already shown that banks do not create any additional surplus value by lending money to an industrial capitalist and charging interest. Now, that's arguable, but let's just go along with this for the moment. Nor do landlords create any additional surplus value by charging the industrial capitalist rent on the land that they use. Interest and rent are merely claims to a share of the surplus already acquired by an industrial capitalist. Interest and rent are merely claims to shares of the surplus already acquired by an industrial capitalist. Now, the point that I will make, just to break in here for a second, is that, I think it's possible to call interest and rent as a claim to a share as a proxy for the surplus. So this is, of course, a kind of a measure of abstraction, but this is sort of the spookiness, as it were, to quote Einstein, the spookiness of the connection of interest and rent to the surplus. That there is some connection, albeit not as palpable, and it certainly isn't necessarily an identity, but there is a connection. And you can, in fact, describe it partially as subsumptive as opposed to subsumption. So that may actually be worth considering in the future. In addition to this, the industrial capitalist must pay the going price for the materials and machinery purchased off of other industrial capitalists, that is constant capital. But now this cost is passed on to their customers in the price of the product. Interest and rent, on the other hand, are paid out of the acquired surplus. This is true. But the paying out and the passing on are, of course, there's some interesting connection to it, that they have influence on it. And it's not necessarily equivalent, but it is something. All right, how else? Also affecting the annual rate of profit, which is retained by the industrial capitalist, is the consideration that all the calculations in Volume 1 concerning one circuit of capital begin with money, M, capital M, big M, exchanged for labor power and means of production, transformed in the process of production into commodities, and then realized again by returning the product to the market, realizing a profit, and you get delta M or M prime. But the capitalist pays rent and interest per annum And his own interest is only in the profit gained per annum. Now, that's also a question as well. It's measured at per annum, but it's a it's a dynamic number. It isn't you have as they say adjustable rates, etc. So it's much more fluid. Let's put it that way. Consequently, the annual profit rate varies according to the circulation time, and it is the annual rate of surplus value which motivates the capitalist as the personification of capital. If you assume, of course, that everything is done, in an annual way. And most of us don't think that way. And I would assert to you that capital doesn't operate that way from a stock flow conception. Further, anyway, back to the text. Further, costs are associated with circulation, and in general, the industrial capitalist will have to lay out a portion of the surplus in order to pay for transporting the product to market, storing it, and for the retailer to sell it. Thus, the transportation and retail industries also claim a portion of the surplus. Yes, indeed. These expenses necessary for the realization of capital, but not adding to the value of the product, are dealt with in Volume 2, entailing the industrial capitalist sharing the capital surplus with other capitalists. It is in the transactions with other industrial capitalists, both those selling means of production and those involved in circulation, that the solution can be found. That the solution can be found to the paradox of equal a portion rate of profit across the economy, despite the variation in the composition of capital from one particular sector of the economy to another, and the determination of value by labor time. Number 5, equalization of the rate of profit. Now, whereas it appears from Volume 1 and 2 that every unit of industrial capital enjoys a different rate of profit, it is an empirical fact that the rate of profit tends to be equal across the economy. Now, how can this be? The rate of profit tends to be equal across the economy. Now, this is contestable, or it has a lot more, details to it. Moseley's most notable contribution to the understanding of Marx's capital is his decisive refutation of the claim that Marx failed to solve the problem of the transformation of values into prices, the so-called transformation problem. So we're refuting this claim that Marx was a failure at working through the transformation of valued prices. This claim, according to Moseley, is based firstly on a failure to understand that the aim of Volume 1 is merely to determine the total surplus value under the assumption that goods are exchanged at their value. That is, price is equal to value. Now, this assumption is valid for the purpose of determining the total surplus value, as any gain from exchange for whatever reason is balanced by the equal loss for the other party, irrespective of its distribution. Now, this assumption makes sense if one takes all the actors in the economy to be independent producers paid for their work by the sale of their product. However, producers who lack their own means of production, and this is effectively all of them, sell their labor power to capitalists who use that labor power to create new value over and above the cost of wages and materials, etc., and become the owners of that product. Thus, the value of the product they have appropriated contains an element of surplus value which can be realized only by the sale of the product. But the market in both capital and goods in such circumstances forces the capitalist to receive an average rate of profit when she sells the product. Now, this must entail goods being exchanged at prices differing from their value, and thus a portion of the surplus extracted by the workers, the use of the workers' labor capacity is either recovered by the employer or passed on to other capitalists via a reduced purchase price. Therefore, it can no longer be presumed that value is the number of hours of socially necessary labor expended in production of the commodity. Products can be no longer presumed to be exchanged at their value when capitalists are doing business with each other. What remains, though, is that once it's sold, the value of a commodity is realized as its price. So capitalist production necessarily entails the sharing of the total surplus, not thanks to swindling, but simply by selling according to different principles than those that are applied in volumes 1 and 2, respectively. The total surplus remains the same as determined in volume 1, but portions of the surplus are passed back and forth by the capitalists according to commercial arrangements dictated by the market. Now, let me break here for a second and say, if in fact one is doing this dictated by the market, are not knowledge or information about interest and rent also sort of built into that as well. Obviously, in some cases, not as directly, but clearly not. It's not asymmetric in the sense that it's hidden. So anyway, back to the text. Just as the commodity market insured commodities sold at their value in volume 1, the capital market ensures an equal rate of profit for all sectors of capital in volume 3. Failure to observe the difference between the simple commodity production and the commodity produced by capital has led others to claim that throughout the book Capital, there is a duality of price and value. The latter, that is value, being taken as the socially necessary labor time embodied in each commodity. So there is a difference between the commodity, the simple commodity production, and the commodity produced by capital. There is some differentiation, that the difference is, probably likely a positive number, right? Anyway, but capitalist production begins and ends with money. And the historical value composition of the commodity, that is constant capital, wages paid, surplus value, is irrelevant once a product is purchased for money by a producer and the value of the product is realized. Only cost of production matter to capital. Certain sectors of the economy, the bank, state, landowners, the industrial capitalists themselves, and the transport, storage, and retail industries take a share of the surplus extracted by industrial capital as accounted for in volumes 1 and 2. Volume 3 of Capital, Book Capital, deals with the fact that particular sections of the economy have a different composition of capital, and thus, other things being equal, they should generate a different rate of profit. Particular sections of the economy have a different composition of capital, and thus, other things being equal, they should generate a different rate of profit. I think that's, sort of underselling the difference question, but, the fact is, it's just, as we've talked about before, more complicated. Volume 2 also examines the distribution of surplus value amongst producers of inputs to industrial capital and among producers of means of subsistence and the luxury goods paid for by capitalists for their own personal consumption of surplus value. The complex picture of the circulation of particular portions of value around the economy. So, in volume 3, Marx does indeed deal with the transformation of values into prices, while maintaining the principle that value is once for all determined at the moment of sale. The result is the sharing of surplus value amongst capitalists in different sectors. Moseley shows that in volume 3, a further distribution of the total surplus takes place between the particular sections of the capitalist economy, this time between particular sectors of the economy with a greater or lesser composition of capital. In effect, those sectors with a lower organic composition of capital, and therefore, according to the arithmetic of volume 1, higher rates of profit, have to share so much of their acquired surplus with other sectors as will bring their rate of profit down to the average, while those with higher organic composition of capital and therefore a lower rate of profit receive a share of the total surplus, which raises their rate of profit to the social average. Now, this sharing of surplus value takes place through a combination of two processes. Number one, the flow of capital between sectors of the economy via the capital markets, and two, the products being sold below or above the values of which would appear to follow from a calculation of added labor time plus constant capital. Note, of course, here that the awareness of the flow of capital between sectors in the economy via the capital markets would have price information and interest information and probably rent information as well. So anyway, that's all possible. The bourgeois myth of the productivity of capital imposes itself on the capitalist as a reality in the appearance of prices, a real illusion. The first mechanism for this process of equalization of the rate of profit is that the higher rate of profit enjoyed in one sector attracts capital investment from another sector with a lower rate of profit, bringing about effectively overcapitalization and underinvestment in the respective industries. The movement of capital from one sector to another does not, however, affect the total surplus value accumulated by the capitalist class as a whole, other than secondary effects the movement has on the total capital investment, which Marx says has a tendency to increase, and the effect on the prices of the means of subsistence, which Marx says has a tendency to decline, along with the decline in the unit costs of production of consumer goods. Now, in addition to this process, with capitalists in a profitable sector selling their products to other capitalists at a depressed price, they are effectively passing a share of that surplus to other capitalists. So it's pretty clear, I hope you can appreciate, that there is some awareness of these other factors while these transactions are occurring. So this also drives the going rate of interest on capital, which capitalists account as part of their costs of production. So costs of production, or cost price as a result, do actually have this, body of knowledge that it's somewhere. Now, thus, equalization of the rate of profit across sectors of the economy occurs by means of competition for capital investment and the free flow of capital in the capital markets, and the suppression or enhancement of the value of the products of different industries. Now, this determines the distribution of capital between sectors of industry. That is, competition so distributes the social capital among the various spheres of production that the prices of production in each sphere take shape according to the model of the prices of production in these spheres of average composition. So this is the book Capital, Volume 3, Chapter 10. Once a commodity is sold, then its value is realized. Its value is realized in the given price. It is this price which enters into the cost of production for other units of capital, both constant and variable capital. A unit of capital in other sectors of the economy, by buying the products at this price, in effect, acquire or give up surplus value to or from the other unit of capital. By selling products relatively cheaply due to underinvestment in the suppressed organic composition of capital, capitalists are in effect subsidizing production in other sectors while still enjoying the average rate of profit. In effect, sharing out surplus value to sectors which have been subject to overinvestment, equalizing the rate of profit. Moseley is at pains to point out the difference between a simple commodity, such as was dealt with in Volume 1 of Capital, and a commodity which is a product of capital. Marx discussed three important differences between commodities as products of capital and simple commodities. The first difference is that the labor which produces capitalist commodities is divided into paid labor and unpaid labor. For example, the value of capitalist commodities contains surplus value. The second difference number two, is that the individual commodity is treated as an aliquot part of the total commodity produced by a given capital rather than as an autonomous article, which means that the price of an individual commodity is not determined by the labor time required to produce this commodity, as with simple commodities, but is instead determined as a fractional part of the total price of all the commodities produced by a given capital, i.e., by dividing this total price by these total prices by the quantity of commodities produced. Now, the accumulation of surplus value by the capitalist class as a whole, as described in Volume 1 of Capital, is unaffected by the equalizing of the rate of profit, which distributes that surplus value and secondarily drives the capital market. In a capitalist enterprise, it's impossible to link any labor act to any one product. The production process in an enterprise can only be taken as a whole. This production process begins with a certain amount of money invested, not with a commodity with a certain amount of labor embodied in it. So it begins with a certain amount of money invested, as opposed to a commodity with, this embodied labor thing. The price realized in the sale of the total product then recovers the money invested, big M, and a profit delta M, divided in some appropriate proportion between the prices of the single products. Now, the price of these products still represents the value of the product, but its price and ipso facto, therefore, value is lower or higher thanks to the composition or capital and the effect of overinvestment or underinvestment of capital across a particular sector. Note, of course, that investment of capital decisions, obviously have some other knowledge built into it, as in the idea that there's a certain amount of symmetry, at least. The capital market thus tends to distort the distribution of labor and capital across the various sectors of the economy in the interest of accumulation of capital, as opposed to the needs of the economy as a whole. One sector subsidizes another by paying higher prices for their products or receiving lower prices for their products. Long-term equilibrium, Moseley is right that Marx wrote Capital entirely on the assumption of long-term equilibrium. This assumption is not intended to be factual, but as an analytical device to separate the dominant tendencies in capitalism from noise. So there is, we can say that there is a kind of filtering process going on. Nevertheless, such an assumption cannot be valid without demonstrating that there is a relevant real tendency towards equilibrium. In Volume 1 of Capital, Marx does this with the observation that if a unit of capital adopts a technological improvement which reduces the cost of producing a product, then competition between or among units in the same trade obliges others to adopt the same movement. The edge that the innovator gets, allowing them to undercut their competitors in the same commodity market, is soon wiped out. And the organic composition of capital and the rate of profit tends to equalize across all the competitors. Now, note that this observation would not make sense if Marx had presented his analysis in terms of a single economy-wide capital. Capital essentially exists in this instance as independent units. It is in the nature of capital that it exists in individual units. Price competition and the flow of capital across sectors of the economy does allow, however, for whole sectors to be treated as if they were a single enterprise for the purpose of determining the total of surplus value. I think Moseley is not warranted in his criticism of others, such as Andrew Kleiman, for efforts to theorize the profit process whereby equilibrium can be restored once it's disturbed. I say this notwithstanding Moseley's profound observation that following Hegel, Marx's logic is one of sequential determination, not of formal logic. So, sequential determination, not a formal logic, and that there's such a sequential determination is compatible with a synchronic investigation, irrespective of diachronic considerations. On the same subject, if, for example, technological change brings about a change in the rate of profit across one particular trade, the restoration of a general rate of profit across the economy depends on competition in the capital market rather than the commodity market. Thus, equalization of the rate of profit across different sectors of the economy is dependent on the flow of capital in the capital market. It is this capital market which really characterizes what is meant by, quote unquote, the whole economy. Notwithstanding both Moseley and Marx, what makes capital in general universal is not its sameness, the sameness of capital, not having some attribute in common across diverse units of production, but rather in the actual flow and metamorphosis of capital across individual units and particular trades through the financial system, okay? So it's not in the sort of flow and transformation of the capital, but rather, the financial system is more important. The individual units of capital really exist simultaneously as a universal whole, like an organism whose cells are constantly renewing themselves. This process derives, in my view, from the twofold character of labor embodied in commodities. This is the contradiction which Marx identifies at the very beginning of Capital, the book, and can be seen to reshape capitalist society right through Volume 3. Moseley often mentions that the equalization of the rate of profit means distributing in proportion to the total capital invested by each unit, and that this is because it is the only rate of profit. It is only the rate of profit, not the rate of surplus value, which motivates the capitalist, of course, as a personification of capital itself. And Moseley is echoing Marx in this view. Individual capitals are treated as shares of the total capital, and they share the total surplus value according to their share of the total capital. So, but it is not self-evident why pursuit of an annual profit should lead to equalization of the rate of profit, and why the hostile brothers kindly treat each other according to the share of each in the total capital when distributing the total of surplus value. So, let me break here for a second. This is about, in some ways, possession. Anyway, the practice of measuring profit relative to total capital derives from the banks having to divide the capital they hold between different investments. The proportionality of profit to capital invested by an individual unit of capital, reenacted in advance by a lending bank, although actually an outcome, determines in advance that the sharing of surplus value will echo this presumption across all sectors of a capitalist economy. The mechanism which restores equilibrium with a uniform rate of profit is that a higher rate of profit attracts capital to a unit insofar as there is free movement of capital, and thereby reduces that higher rate of profit to the general level. Now, however, there is no endpoint to these adjustments. The movement of capital into trades in which labor power is more productive of surplus producers, the movement of capital into trades in which labor power is more productive of surplus produces ongoing changes in the distribution of capital across the economy. So, 6, the universal individual in Hegel. So Moseley's one of the few who have recognized that Marx's Capital draws its structure from the third book of Hegel's logic, the concept logic. The first section of the concept logic is what Hegel calls the subject. The internal development of the subject, this is capital S, is this instance that is capital, and this first section is marked by 3 moments, namely universal, particular, and individual, or universal, particular, and subjective. The preceding 2 books of the logic, Being and Essence, do not form part of the exposition of the subject, but represent its genesis, reflected in the prior development of economy itself and the science of political economy. Objective logic, therefore, which treats of being and essence, constitutes properly the genetic exposition of the concept, big C concept, as described Hegel, 1815. Now, I will elaborate on Hegel's method as exhibited by Marx in Capital in my own terms separately, but Moseley has made important discoveries in how Marx approached the use of Hegel's concept logic, but has also made errors, in some of which he is echoing Marx himself as I see it. The section of the science of logic entitled The Idea of Cognition is where Hegel explains his method of building any science. The relevant passage begins, "The progress proper to the concept from universal to particular is the basis and the possibility of a synthetic science, of a system, and of systematic cognition." This is Hegel, 1816. And this is precisely the approach Marx takes. As Moseley correctly points out, Volume 1 is entirely devoted to capital in general, that is, the universal. However, capital in general is defined by Marx as what capital essentially is. That is, the most essential properties which are common to all capitals and which distinguish capital from simple commodities or money and other forms of wealth. The production of surplus value common to all is a true definition of capital in general, but it's not a true definition of universal capital. Marx did not subtitle Volume 1 Capital in General, but it is clear enough that Marx did in fact begin from the concept of capital as universal. The concept of capital as universal. The German language does not clearly distinguish itself between these two concepts. See the syllogism of reflection or the syllogism of allness in Hegel's Science of Logic for Beginners. Moseley gives a better definition than that given by Marx. The reason why Marx's theory begins with the general form of surplus value is that it is based on the assumption that all 12 particular forms of surplus value come from the same source, that is, the surplus value of the workers. As Ilyanov explained, it is that other to which all capitals relate in common, which identifies them as capital, not to a property of themselves which is held in common. This definition is better because it defines the unit of capital in terms of the transformation of value elaborated in part 2 of volume 1, which constitutes a unit as part of the universal capital, that is, big M, big C, big M, plus delta M. That is, the removal of money from circulation and its return to circulation, thereby expanding itself. The further specification of capital in volume 3, number 2. The further specification of capital in part 3 of volume 1 as industrial capital is the appropriation of surplus labor time of workers. It is not so much being something in common between units of capital, which is important, but the characteristic movement of value, which constitutes all units of capital as part of the same universal capital. Moseley cites Marx in the Grundrisse, that is, capital in general, as distinct from particular capitals, is an abstraction which grasps the specific characteristics which distinguish capitals fine mart. And a little later, capital in general is also defined as what all capitals have in common. The introduction of many capitals must not interfere with the investigation here. The relation of the many will rather be explained after what they all have in common, the quality of being capital, has been examined. This is, again, citing Marx in the Grundrisse. It does seem, at times at least, Both Moseley and Marx did not see the distinctive way in which Hegel understood the truly universal as distinct from the merely general. Now, this distinction is reflected in Hegel's comment on Rousseau. The aforementioned difference between the merely communal and the truly general is aptly expressed in Rousseau's well-known social contract, in which it is said that the laws of a state must arise from the general will, the volonté or the volonté générale, but need not, therefore, be the will of all, volonté de tous. Now, words aside, this beginning with universal capital is entirely consistent with analyzing how the total surplus value exploited from a working class is accumulated. And this Marx does, as Moseley has shown. Volume 2 examines how each unit of capital shares the surplus value it acquires as part of constituting itself as capital by returning products to circulation and recovering money from circulation with a profit, and the circulation of value entailed in the reproduction of variable, constant, and surplus value. Volume 3 then deals with particular forms of capital. A unit of capital can constitute itself as capital only by exploiting labor in some particular way, in some trade. The relevant characteristic here is the specific market which the capital is serving. Each particular sector will determine a socially necessary composition of capital through competition in that market. Hence, the reason why, deputies and etc. So each particular sector will determine a socially necessary composition of capital through competition in that market. Now here, the surplus value acquired by an entire sector of the economy competing with each other in the same trade under the same technical conditions becomes the subject, doubtless represented politically by a peak industrial body. Moseley recognizes that this phase of capital is the particular moment of Hegel's concept logic, right? Universal, then to the particular. And he provides quotes to indicate that Marx saw it that way too. Rather annoyingly, however, Moseley regularly refers to a sector of the economy not as particular capital, but as individual capital. But we're definitely not dealing with individual capital, but our capitals which realize their profits in the same market. The individual capital is the immediate, concrete, developed unit of capital, the individual firm or business. It is this concreteness that characterizes individual as Hegel sees it. It is clear enough that to complete capital and make it a comprehensive textbook of political economy, further volumes on, individual capitals would individual capitals would be required. But equally, Marx may have had little interest in effect, teaching capitalists how to make money. And further, the task of elaborating the science to this degree of detail is a task exceeding the capacities of one person, even Marx, at that point in the history of the science. However, Moseley cites Marx, rejecting the need for an extension of the work to the individual moment of capital for what strikes me as being a strange reason. Marx rejected Hegel's interpretation of singularity because the singularity of capital, that is interest banking capital, is not the perfect embodiment of the inner nature of capital, but is instead the perfect obfuscation of the inner nature of capital. So this is that moment, right? It's not embodiment, but rather obfuscation, which implies, that it already is or presupposes a kind of embodiment, a presence in that sense. Anyway, this does indeed reflect Marx's view, but seemingly not Hegel's, because for Hegel, the individual or singular, remember there are three terms, universal, particular, and singular. The individual or singular is a single concrete entity, not a number of entities with something in common. Now, it seems to me that Marx never solved a difficult quandary in analysis of capitalism, which is reflected in this problem with the interpretation of Hegel's moments of the concept. On the whole, rich people, capitalists, do not own capital as such. They probably have large bank accounts, but fundamentally they own companies or shares in companies, and it is comparable. Well, it is companies which are the actors in the economy. It is companies, firms, which are the basic units of capital and the basic form of organization of the capitalist class. Now, but it's still individual persons who own capital through their shares and such like in companies. And it is those individuals who could trade in those shares on the capital market. It seems that there is a whole other layer of movement of capital entailed in ownership of capital over and above the productive capacity activity, the productive activity of capital itself. So far as I know, this problem remains unresolved. So, whole other layer of movement of capital entailed in ownership of capital over and above the productive activity of capital itself. However, it is a general rule that the more abstract the appearance of an entity, the more powerful it is as a vehicle for objectification of social relations. Coinage has long failed to live up to the needs of capitalism for money. Money is now almost entirely intangible. But Marx goes on to remark on particular forms of capital and surplus value that develop out of the germ of capital in general. Now, in fact, this development from a single germ cell and 14 continued mutual transformations, which marks what is universal, not what is common among them. The unit of capital dealt with in Volume 1 is an ideal, not the concrete individual, just as universal does not mean general or what all we have in common, but the totality of capital. So there's an idealist kind of construction at the front end. Now, Moseley brings evidence from the Grundrisse, which includes the interpretation of individual, aka singularity, depending on the translator, as the concrete individually developed unit of capital, the individual firm or business. However, the fact that shares and such like are the means by which an individual person can own capital obfuscates the unit of capital itself. An individual person owns capital by owning a share in a company, but it is the company which is the individual capital. An individual person's relation to the exploitation of labor power is mediated by the company they work for or have shares in. The concept in Hegel's logic can be interpreted as some species, that is, universal, including a range of variables, that is, the particulars, and individual organisms. But the subject here is capital, a social relation or form of activity, not a species. How to interpret the concept logic in terms of a social practice like capital. So Moseley draws attention to a passage in the Grundrisse where Marx is ruminating on different possible ways of interpreting the three moments of the subject as capital. Capital, number one, universality. 1A, the emergence of capital out of money. B, capital and labor mediating itself through alien labor. C, the elements of capital dissected according to their relation to labor, that is, product, raw material, instrument of labor, etc. Number two, particularization of capital, that is, as capital circulant or capital fixe. Turnover of capital. 3, singularity of capital, capital and profit, capital and interest, capital as value, distinct from itself as interest and profit. Particularity, Roman numeral 2, peculiarity. Number 1, accumulation of capitals. Number 2, competition of capitals. Number 3, concentration of capitals, the quantitative distinction of capital as at the same time qualitative as measure of its size and influence. Roman numeral 3. Singularity. I have copied Moseley formatting the quote, but use the word universal rather than the translator's choice of generality for oligomine. Universal is the conventional translation when referring to the moments of the concept. That is, number 1, capital as credit. Number 2, capital as stock capital. Number 3, capital as money market. Now, note, of course, that there are costs associated with all of these things. Anyway, here we see Marx experimenting around 1858 on how to render Hegel's moments of the subject, with the subject being capital, sometime after he had committed himself to a plan of reconstructing capital by rising from the abstract to the concrete. Now, the use of universal, particular, and individual in a tiered fashion like this is not how this section of the logic works. Logically, it makes no sense. What we do see is how in the section 3, singularity, Marx considered 3 possible ways in which an individual person can be an owner of capital. But a glance at the above plan shows that this is not, in fact, how Marx eventually proceeded in writing Capital, the book. In the end, Volume 1 was devoted to the universal moment, capital in general. A number of different approaches and 2 particularity are dealt with in the following 2 volumes. Now, this is quite consistent with Hegel's concept logic. Volume 2 deals with distribution and circulation of capital between sectors of the economy producing capital goods, means of subsistence realized out of wages, and luxury goods ultimately purchased out of surplus value. And the distribution of the surplus value from the individual, and the distribution of the surplus value from the industrial capitalists to landlords, lenders, distributors, and retailers. Altogether, the circulation of capital and the problems which arise from the realization of the constant, variable, and surplus value determined in Volume 1, period. Volume 3 goes to the capital market, and exchange of products between industrial capital. So it's a scale difference where the necessary equalization of the rate of profit leads to surplus value being distributed between particular sectors of capital. The general schema of the logic of the subject is not sufficient to explain this. However, Moseley is right that particularity is taken in Volume 3 in relation to the competition or to the composition of capital for Marx to explain the equalization of the rate of profit without abandoning the concept of value established in Volume 1. And he goes on to trace the further movement of that mass of surplus value in the finance system. Looking back at Marx's early exploration of the moments of the concept in connections with capital, we see that Marx could have pursued an analysis of capital by means of examination of the various ways individual persons can own capital, but he did not take that path. Now, thanks to Moseley's examination of Marx's manuscripts, as we've noted with, the 1859 to 816 first person drawing. So, thanks to Moseley's examination of Marx's manuscripts, we can see the protracted process that eventually led Marx to a fruitful examination of Hegelian logic to his analysis of potluck economy. His understanding of Hegelian logic in this cabinet to his cabinet till right in Looking back at Marx's early exploration of the moments of the concept in connection with capital, we see that Marx could have pursued an analysis of capital by means of examination of the various ways individual persons can own capital, but he did not take that path. Thus, thanks to Moseley's examination of Marx's manuscripts, we can see that the protracted process that eventually led Marx to a fruitful application of Hegelian logic to his analysis of political economy, his understanding of the logic developed through his struggle with the subject matter over a period of 10 years. Moseley says, Marx criticized Hegel for surrounding his method in mysticism, assuming that the universal is the absolute spirit, for example. But Marx praised Hegel for correctly understanding the relation between the universal and the particular forms of the universal. Moseley also says, for Hegel, the universal substance is the absolute spirit, which incarnates itself in particular forms of objective reality. Now, this is, of course, the idealist nature of Hegel's philosophy, which Marx completely rejected. For Marx, the universal substance is materialist. This is the inversion, right? Is materialist, that is, abstract labor. Now, indeed, Marx did criticize Hegel in such a way, but no one mentions the fact that capital deals with only one subject, that is, capital, while the logic is intended to cover how multiple subjects, family, church, state, etc., interact with one subject, that such as capital, merge with it, and realize an entire social formation. The universal is not the absolute spirit, is the universal moment of one subject among many. Nor is the absolute abstract labor. Even in the most developed capitalism imaginable, but there are still other subjects and other kinds of activity. Capital is not self-sustaining for itself. Capital relies on nature and human communities to renew themselves despite the predation of capital. Such interactions are the subject matter of the remainder of the concept logic, that is, the object and idea, which are not within the scope of capital. Too bad. However, if you are inspired to write the unity of the capitalist state and economy, then the second phase of the concept logic, the object, is the relevant logic. So, Marx did tackle the problem of how industrial capital interacts with other sections of capital, especially in Volume 2. How did Hegel inform Marx in his approach to the problem? Marx had not yet fully solved the problem of how to interpret the subject matter of the logic, the text logic, in a study of political economy, although he did prefigure it, in my view, in the very first article of his mature work, the Theses on Feuerbach of 1845. So, number 7, Marx's starting point. One aspect of Hegel's logic which applied to the various sciences, which Hegel outlined in the encyclopedia, Marx figured out in the section of the Grundrisse called Method of Political Economy. Marx drew the conclusion that every system of political economy, including his own, had first to derive the simplest determinations through analysis of the concrete data and an imminent critique of existing systems, then reconstruct capital concretely by a synthesis beginning from these simplest determinations. Now, that synthesis would be capital. We know from notes that he later wrote in 1888 that rather than value, he would begin from the simplest social form in which the product of labor is presented in contemporary society, and this is the commodity. I cannot say whether Marx had read the relevant passage in the Science of Logic explaining this method in the idea of cognition, the beginning of which was cited above, but this method is exhibited through various books of the encyclopedia, so it is possible that Marx figured it out whether he read the explanatory passage in the Logic. The progress, proper to the concept, from universal to particular, is the basis and the possibility of a synthetic science, of a system, and of systematic cognition. Now, the passage already cited above continues. The first requisite for this is, as we have shown, that the beginning be made with the subject matter in the form of a universal allgemeinen, in the sphere of actuality, whether of nature or spirit, is the concrete individuality, the concrete Einzelheit, that is given to subjective natural cognition as the first. But in cognition, that is a comprehension, at least to the extent that it has the form of the concept for basis. The first must be, on the contrary, something simple, something abstracted from the concrete, because in this form alone has the subject matter the form of the self-related universal, or of an immediate based on the concept. So Hegel advises that a science must begin both from the universal, that is capital and general, and the simplest individual unit, that is the commodity. So you have the universal, the capital and general, and the unit, which is the commodity. Marx took it that while the unifying content of political economy is value, capital, the most developed self-valorizing form of value, and consequently the real subject matter, period. So Marx took it that while the unifying content of political economy is value, capital, the most developed self-valorizing form of value, and consequently the real subject matter. Volume 1 determines not only the total surplus value, but the total social product and its division into constant, variable, and surplus labor. Part 1 of Volume 1 deals with the commodity, that is the simplest social form of value, and Marx's application of this method in relation to his starting point has been widely discussed in the literature. What is always overlooked, however, is that Marx continued this approach, as did Hegel in the encyclopedia, as he took up successive key concepts of political economy, only the first of which was capital. Now, in part 2, Marx introduces capital by means of Moneybags, Mr. Moneybags, who buys in order to sell at a profit. Our friend Moneybags, who as yet is only an embryo capitalist, who as yet is only an embryo capitalist, must buy his commodities at their value, must sell them at their value, and yet at the end of the process must withdraw more value from circulation than he threw into it at starting. This is from Capital Volume 1. This is the germ cell, to use the word Marx uses in the preface to the first German edition. Here it is embryo. Der Keim was Hegel's term. The first, when beginning the synthesis of a new concrete concept. Moneybags, buying in order to sell, is the unit of capital, which is to be understood as the germ cell of a single capitalist company, a firm. A new unit in the development, in the development of value, the simplest form of capital. It's a new unit of and the development of capital, the simplest form of capital. It would have been utterly at odds with the method of the logic for Marx to have begun with the total capital. It would have been utterly at odds with the method of the logic, the text logic, for Marx to have begun with the total capital, total surplus value, etc., even though this is the intent of Volume 1, as Moseley has correctly identified. To do so would have represented capital as if it could be a single entity across the entire economy, like the USSR effectively aspired to be. Whereas the concept of capital is precisely units like money bags, which grow to become companies, but are always in competition with other units of capital like themselves. So while meticulously refuting those who take Volume 1 at face value, so to speak, in which the subject matter is really individual capitalist firms, Moseley does not touch on why the universal is represented as many individual units, in which, in this form alone, has the subject matter the form of the self-related universal or of an immediate based on the concept. One important insight, which Moseley brings to the Hegelian roots of capital is his claim that Marx's logic is a logic of sequential determination. He claims that others have interpreted the logic, including the algebraic representation of the logic of capital, as simultaneous determination in the manner of formal logic, and connected with this, interpret capital as a self-replicating system. Now, but capital is not a system as such, because it is, in its very essence, subject to continual change through the spontaneous interaction of innumerable units. This is why the claim of long-term equilibrium can only be a relative claim for analytical purposes. The contradiction between quantitative exchange value and qualitative use value continuously drives the reshaping of the capitalist economy through competition. That is, competition which, as Marx points out, is inherently self-canceling. But Hegel's logic is also a logic of sequential determination, and this is how Hegel introduces a sense of time into logic, okay? I can only say a sense of time, quote unquote, because time itself does not figure in the logic. So, this is another proxy problem or indexical problem. According to Hegel, time only arises in the sciences of the spirit, but it is this sequential determination exhibiting itself as sublation in the logic, which distinguished Hegel's logic from system theory. Oh, and I am grateful to Moseley for this insight. Moseley notes that Marx added a quantitative dimension to Hegel's logic of the concept because Marx's theory is a theory of capitalism, and quantity is the main thing about capitalism. It is the judgments which buyers and sellers make every time they act in the economy, which reduces every social product to an exchange value, which makes this possible. And it is capital which makes this process of, quote unquote, real abstraction ubiquitous. Number 8, on Marx's theory of money, Moseley explains Marx's theory of money as follows. Throughout, Marx assumes that money is in fact gold. Now, he did this for simplification reasons, right? In Volume 1 anyway. Because of its physical properties and its relative scarcity for centuries, gold had functioned as money, as a store of value, as a means measurement of value, as a medium of exchange, and as capital. Despite that fact that paper currency was already commonplace in Marx's time. That is, money as an actual commodity was a germ cell of money from which the multiplicity of forms of money grew. Gold embodies a definite quantity of abstract labor, being the average socially necessary amount of labor time required to find, mine, and mint a given quantity of gold. However, since gold is money, it cannot be said to have a value, surplus or otherwise. As soon as the production costs of mining in a given gold mine generates a rate of profit below the going rate of profit, capital would be withdrawn from the mine, deployed elsewhere, and gold mining would cease in the given mine. So now, does this, is this measurable in that particular sense? Anyway, that's a question. Thus, the rate of profit in gold mining equals the general rate of profit. However, Moseley says that it is widely agreed among Marxist political economists that it makes no difference to capitalism whether money is gold or whether it's paper money backed by the state or bank credit backed by the secure bank, as long as there is no uncertainty about the abstract labor represented by a unit of money. Gold is not the only option for this. The downside of relying on gold mining for a money supply is that the cycle of capitalist production begins from money. The investment of new capital, there can be no profit generated. Without the investment of new capital, there can be no profit generated. Limiting the total price of production to the amount of gold available prevents the expansion of capital beyond very severe limits. So long as everyone trusts the central bank and the commercial banks to limit the issuing of capital to a level which maintains the going general rate of profit, a piece of their paper is as good as gold. Another important conclusion of Moseley's study is that the average price of a commodity is not affected by changes in the price of labor power. The average price of a commodity is not affected by changes in the price of labor power. An increase in wages, in this case, leaves K plus P, that is cost of production plus general rate of profit, unaffected, just as it would leave the commodity's value unaffected, and simply brings about a corresponding converse movement, a decrease or increase on the side of the profit rate. This is citing Marx in Capital Volume 3. All that is affected is the proportion between constant capital and variable capital. The movement of the total social capital between particular sectors of the economy will ensure that the profit rate will be equalized and that increasing wage costs absorbed by reduction in the average rate of profit. That this is, of course, an observation of great interest to the workers' movement. See? Number 9, Section 9, value of labor power. The cost of buying the means of subsistence for the working class may be greater or less than their value, as determined through the sharing of surplus value appropriately for the composition of capital in the sectors producing means of subsistence, presuming that these goods are to be purchased from capitalists. The prices of the means of subsistence and means of production are also equal to their prices of production, not their values, not their values. But proletarians, by definition, have no capital and do not own their own tools or the materials they work on. Consequently, under the rule of capital, they do not earn any rate of profit or exercise of their labor power, and therefore the production of the labor power whose use they sell to the capitalist is unproductive labor, i.e., it does not produce surplus value. Surplus value is produced by the use of labor power. The vulnerability of proletarians to exploitation allows this to happen. Under the rule of capital, even the self-employed artisan who competes with the employed proletarian will pay rent to the landlord and interest to the bank, absorbing the surplus value they create for capital, leaving nothing for them as long as they compete with proletarians. Marx accepted that services such as the labor of a schoolmaster can be commodities if they produce surplus value for a capitalist employer outside the sphere of production of material objects. A schoolmaster is a productive laborer when, in addition to belaboring the heads of his scholars, he works like a horse to enrich the school proprietor. This is Capital, Volume 1. Marx regarded domestic labor as something capitalists purchased out of their share of the surplus value and had nothing to say about domestic servants were in working class households, domestic services in domestic class households, whether purchased from the market, as they frequently are today, or by the unpaid labor of women. You see where that opens up. Marx had nothing to say about the labor component of producing labor power, and consequently Moseley has nothing to say about this in the book under consideration either. Marx took the archetypal commodity to be material object rather than a service. It's uglier otherwise. This made sense in three ways. Number one, in his day, services were largely luxuries purchased by capitalists out of their share of the surplus. Number two, only things can be accumulated, not services, although coupons, right, or whatever. And three, he needed this archetype against the view of political economists that the worker, capitalist, and landlord, you need an Oxford comma there, each received a share of the profit according to the value of their quote-unquote service. But in principle, Marx was clear that services sold to capital for the extraction of surplus value can be commodities too. If the means of subsistence cost more than their value, then workers will be obliged to work longer than the necessary labor time in order to purchase their means of subsistence and must be paid accordingly by the employer. Producing labor power is an industry like any other, except that it employs no capital and consequently earns no profit for its seller. So, number 10, conclusion. Yeah, we finally got there, right? Moseley has shown that the production price theory is opposed to the idea of a quantity of embodied labor being passed down and accumulated in the chain of production. That is, production price theory makes the equalization of the rate of profit comprehensible while retaining the insights of Volume 1, determining the total quantity and source of surplus value in the unpaid labor of the working class. Equalization of the rate of profit is achieved thanks to competition for price and competition for capital between particular sections of the economy, distributing the total surplus value extracted from the working class in a manner that differs from the quantity of surplus value originating from each sector. This is ensured by the free movement of capital. In Volume 1, it was assumed that every product is sold at its value, that is abstract labor, as in a hypothetical society of independent commodity producers, where the impact of a capital market is left out of the picture. On the other hand, given long-term equilibrium, remember, long-term equilibrium, every time a product is sold by a capitalist producer, the price is determined according to the necessary cost of production plus the going rate of profit. Competition between capitalists cannot demand it. And the rule is enforced by the lending practices of the banks. However, the price of the product remains the appearance of its value. Surplus value is distributed among capitalists along the chain of production. If the composition of a given capital unit were to be equal to the average across the economy, and the composition of capital in all the industries producing the means of subsistence likewise equal to its value, these are unlikely assumptions, then that firm would buy its inputs at value and sell its output at cost price plus profit, which would likewise be equal to the value of the product as determined by embodied abstract labor. Now you can see the construction of this sentence makes it, reveals that it's an unlikely, possibility. However, Even given long-term equilibrium in the sense which Moseley assumes, this is unlikely to be ever the case because of the technical differences between diverse sectors of the economy. The difference between the presumption of commodities sold at their value in Volume 1, determining rates of surplus value and profit for each unit, and the finding of Volume 3 that prices are determined by the general rate of profit and the costs of production is a difference arising in the course of the systematic dialectical reconstruction of the capitalist economy. There's a lot there. But it is, it's ultimately the scale question. Again, the analysis moves from simple commodity production by independent producers to commodity production by capital, such that the rate of profit in every sector is invariant with respect to the composition of capital in each particular sector. Workers are paid for their labor power, not any part of the product they are involved in producing, and are subject to exploitation. The abstraction of simple commodity production, obviously counterfactual in a time of industrial capital, is a valid abstraction because of the abstract nature of labor in developed industrial capitalism. It is not that workers have something in common which allows the theorist to form a concept of universal labor, but that all workers must sell their labor to capital, and for capital, any worker is interchangeable with any other. It is just abstract, featureless labor. This is how I critically summarize the results of Moseley's meticulous reconstruction of Marxist thinking as he formulated what became the 3 volumes of Capital. Moseley's scholarship allows us to see that Marx did not begin with a clear conception, but rather figured it out in the course of working through the theoretical and empirical data over a period of many years, at times hesitating or quote unquote misspeaking, but ultimately arriving at an analysis whose internal logic is impeccable. While I have made and will continue to make criticisms of how Moseley and Marx himself understood the relation of the logic of capital to Hegel's logic, it is clear that Marx, in many respects, surpassed what Hegel was able to present in his logic. It is important to grasp these differences because we live in new conditions and face new problems, and both writers have much to offer. Needless to say, there's a lot more there, and one needs to sort of assess all of the differences at work. But that gets us to the end of the text itself. And since, well, there are people actually there. So what I'm going to do is ask whether there are any questions. We're still on live stream, so if there are any questions, I did create I think I did create a breakout room. So if people just want to go there and do whatever alternative things they want to deal with, you can do that. All right. Well, there are no questions. Are there questions? Anyone?
I can't think of one at the moment. Sorry.
Oh, okay. I hope people can see what I was doing here. And there's a first section of this, which I did earlier today. So there's actually 3 hours of yammering, 3.5 hours of yammering. The point I began with this idea of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, and the organic composition of capital, which are both ways of thinking about the generalized problem of the commodity, ultimately, and a way in which you can approach the problems of value and price. And the whole point of this little exercise that the author who's commenting on Moseley is getting at, Andy Blunden, is trying to show that Marx retains the structure of certain elements of Hegel's logic, and he doesn't discard it. Many people believe that, in the inverting of certain relations, that Hegel is just sort of negated or obliterated. No, he's not. Essentially, he's using Hegelian logic not against itself so much as except to see it as he does with the move to Feuerbach, is this idea that um, the material or materialism changes the nature of Hegelian idealism. And that's sort of the crux of the problem. In other words, Hegel's popularity in popularity as such, in terms of, for example, American idealism, there is an American idealism, American Hegelianism, even, and it is the one that ultimately becomes a kind of pragmatism, I think it's Royce uh, who embodies that in particular in terms of, a quote unquote American Hegelianism, and it is a kind of important move to see that there's still Hegelianism at work. I mean, I think you could even say that in conceiving of a kind of single text, sort of Henry George thing, that it's symptomatic of, and because I think Henry George was following on the same uh, kind of idealism that Royce was doing. So, it's of a piece in that particular way. And one needs to get a sense of how all of this fits together, that there are idealisms at work. Marx sees them, sees, Hegel's logic, and shows that there is a structure here, no different, well, maybe different, than the Frankfurt School, in that, you have these elements of the dialectic, the negation of the negation, all of those things are sort of there. And that um, they're not at odds. I mean, they can be contestable, but they sort of fit. Everything fits together in a kind of useful way. That is that Marx was going in the right direction. He's working through this, and that there are certain things that either got changed or were necessary for a variety of reasons. Remember that Volume One, as I have said before, and as I think you could see in the commentaries, that Volume One, is a kind of front-loaded model. And so that all these things that become more complicated later on for people, for interpreters, or for more analytic scholars, is price, are price and value the same? Why is gold used at the front end? I mean, he does it for simple reasons of simplification, but he also is doing it in terms of, he does it for abstract reasons. That is, the idea here is that you have this, fairly nice little kind of concept of how the world works, that labor sort of fits in this, but it fits in with it at a kind of, with all due respect, a kind of logical level or a structural level, or a degree of abstraction. And so that's at work there. Okay, so I think I got to the end of my yammering, and I went over time anyway, and so I will stop. But let me note that this is how I want to do office hours in the future, is that, and I'm not going to read directly from the text. I just happen to be reading today because I started hours ago. I cranked out 2+ hours of reading, simply because I wanted people to get a sense of, well, the thing will be available at an earlier moment. I'll have yammered already about it. The reading will be there, and we can talk about it if people want to talk about it. And for me, it's useful because the reading allows me to sort of work through what is relevant or important about all of these different authors. And the point of using Andy Blunden's piece here is that he's working out, the difference. Ultimately, this is the difference between Moseley and Heinrich. This is this is the way in which you approach the value problem without having to go to even further lengths to talk about it. And I know that from the Heinrich point of view, to call it or to use the concept of form makes more sense in non-English, whatever that means. And our tendency is, when the invocation of form appears, that we already in the back of our little brains goes form and content, as though form were a container for content. And that's just not the way it works. Simply, that's just not the way it works. It's only a certain type of thinking that would make form the container for content. It just doesn't work that way. And I think you can see this here. That is the way in which paid and unpaid labor occur, a variety of how things are sublated, how subsumption operates. All of these things are done with certain a kind of spooky distance, as they might say, as Einstein would say, that there is without getting into a sciencey kind of thing on it, you can say that the conceptual nature of all of these things has a certain connection. And what we must guard against when we do this kind of analysis is to make it functional or to reduce it to the functional. It's similar to what Bellamy Foster is doing when he's trying to incorporate angles in that kind of in the scientific discourse. Is that one of the problems, of course, is to see it within the context of the dialectic, to see it as a broader set of relations, and to not forget that everything is situated, as I tried to point out earlier, the question of whether there is an ontology that actually comes up, and I think that that's really important to consider. So anyway, your mileage may vary, and so I will stop right now because I've gone over time.
I did
Thank you
think of
very
a
much.
question.
Oh, okay.
Um,
Ask away.
Thanks, Tim. The so there's this obfuscation where the individual through the company sort of masks ownership.
Yes.
Is that an example of where Marx kind of leverages Hegel but turns it on its head?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a good
Cool.
example. It's mystification, isn't it? Right?
Yeah, yeah.
What right does the capitalist have to order you around? I mean, is it just simply because he owns the means of production? I mean, what gives him the right to do that? I mean, what, as a social relation, you've agreed to do this because of the wages, and that's one way of looking at it. But in another way, it is this other set of things that's going on that relates to the economy, that relates to, power.
Yeah, that
Right? He's
also
made.
happens.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say that also happens with I'm trying to remember shoot, now I'm going to forget. Shoot.
It's
I
okay.
lost it.
It's
This is really
okay.
hard to grasp.
Well, yeah, I mean, it takes a while, and it's taken me a while, these months, to kind of work through this kind of set of thinking. But I find it just,
Do you think governments are guilty of the same thing now, though?
well, yes,
Because
absolutely.
we appoint
Absolutely.
the head of a government, and it's their government, but they've got
Right.
no real fucking control.
Yes, absolutely. That's the whole point of Frankfurt School criticism, is that we give up the power. We legitimate their existence. We don't have to do that.
We're giving up power to them, who've given up power to the capitalists. They've given up power to
Well,
money,
yeah,
basically.
they're right. Well, they're representatives of the state, and the
Yeah.
state coordinates, all this capital.
Hmm.
Now, what modern money theory does is try to recuperate that, is to say, well, actually, the state is a useful thing. And that's what socialism is about. Ultimately, modern money theory is socialism in disguise. It's more democratic, of course, because that's kind of what it's doing. But it is something, that's its purpose. Ultimately, is to re-seize the money system.
Well, I believe in a big state as long as it's democratic. I
Oh
genuinely
yeah,
do that
absolutely.
because I've had an NHS. I think this is the thing why America is very much about little government. You're being taught that big government equals authoritarianism and stuff, and it's the opposite.
Right.
If you've got big government and more democracy, you've got more say in how things go, and we saw that after the war. And that's actually
Absolutely.
why when the thing collapsed in '73, the whole post-war consensus thing, that's why
Yes,
we've ended up in this shit, because they did start to reduce the state, the collect, because a big state in a democracy is it's part of a collective bargaining thing. It's like having a say at your workplace, like it's like that, but on a national scale, it's the same sort of thing.
exactly.
It's
Well,
only when people
with
think
that,
of big state, they think of authoritarians and fucking Stalin and all that shit.
yes,
And it's not the case at all if it's done right.
absolutely.
And if
And
anything, it grows the economy because the economies grew when we had big states.
exactly.
If they cared about the economy, really, genuinely, and they don't, it's they'd want a bigger state because then you build shit, you build schools, you build everything, you repair stuff that's fucked. Um, and relying on capital, that's never going to happen.
No. Well, and that's where there's at loggerheads, there's
Yeah,
this illusion, a kind of privatized illusion that it's an agency problem that
yeah,
uh, you know, big capitalists, Bezos, whatever, Ellison et al., that they're the real agents of,
yeah,
capitalism. No, they're not. They just happen to own shit, you
yeah,
know, and we let them own shit, which is really the other side of the
They give
state
us these
problem.
excuses. I remember the thing, another one of the excuses is this, we take the risk, so we
Right,
get the reward.
oh.
right. That's
Yeah, because
their,
people
it's a
dangling off a
con.
scaffold and
Yeah,
wiping a window, they're not taking any fucking risk, are they? You know what I mean? The
Yes,
guy cleaning the window of the fucking
yeah.
high-rise office block, not taking any risks whatsoever on his fucking 12 quid a day wage, you know?
right.
It'd be like, I'm sick of that argument. Look, we sit up all night worrying about how rich we're going to be next week. It might not be as rich as we are this week. Shit.
Well, good. I'm glad we've come to there's a consensus building. This is good.
Was I
I
think
mean,
it might have always been there.
Okay.
and but there is all this mystification that goes on, that, well, and you see it operative every day, and you see it's kind of the baroque versions of it by seeing, the completely crazy people in charge that unfortunately in this democracy, we've allowed to take over, which is really fucked up. But
Well,
um,
actually, I'm beginning to think that this. It's like the point is with well, the likes of Trump, the fact that he is utterly shambolic and incompetent and has arisen to president. That's the rich taking the piss, literally.
mm,
They've just shown you how easy it is to get someone to be president. The dumbest, fucking moronic, stupid, self-obsessed, fucking pedophile. We've got him to the top. Well done, democracy. You know what I mean? And it's not democracy. It's because like if you people have been turned to sort of blur the lines between reality and whatever appears on TV. So it's like politics has turned into a celebrity thing.
Yes,
It's happened here now. 'Cause we used to mock America for that, you know. Look at them,
absolutely.
that stupid presidential stuff, and we're trying to embrace it, but at the same time, the people aren't. It's sort of being forced upon us. It's like they make it about the
Strictly.
man or the woman all the time now. They never used to do that. It used to be about the party at least or the
Right.
policies at hand. So it's like
The,
um
le- the least common denominator in rules.
so I think they're
Yes.
trying to erode they're purposely trying to erode confidence in government. That's what's going on now.
Yes. In the
Yeah, I
American
think.
context, that was, it's a libertarian kind of move, that and it's contradictory, of course. It's the same simple argument that, you know, big state is a big problem, it's socialism and blah blah blah.
Mhm.
And then the counter argument is, well, who pays for the roads and et cetera, and the
Yeah.
infrastructure.
Mhm.
And it is as simple as that, actually.
Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Uh,
yeah.
This is the thing people complain about potholes and they won't vote for a socialist. Like that fucking shit ain't going to get fixed as long as you've got a right wing person anywhere near power, because they
right.
don't give a fuck about anything but themselves. That's all they care about. Every right winger. Just because there's a lot of them with the same mentality doesn't mean they're all like some cohesive unit. They're all try to always stab each other in the back.
Yep.
Yeah, that's why the whole power structure is based on compromise. That's all compromise. That's all it is. They've got
Mm-hmm.
no ideology as such. Just, oh,
Hmm.
well, I've been bullied into doing this job because if I don't do it, such and such is going to say, oh, well, he's a kiddie fiddler, you know, or such and such is going to say, oh, well, there are those accounts. You know, oh, well, was that time you did this? That it's all compromise on the right
Yep. Yep.
and a lot of it in the center, and to some
Well, and
extent, of course, on the left, but it's not the same. It's not like we're not in hock to fucking rich people and we'll do anything for money. It's insane. Sorry, went off on a rant there. It's it's a budget day in Britain.
budget day.
Yes, it's been the autumn budget today.
Ah.
And there are some economists saying basically, I think that might be the last budget ever for government, not the Labour government, ever. They're like the thing that's fucked. And
Can they shut down the government like here with the
no, we don't
reconciliation?
do that. No, they're threatening. They're saying there's going to be another gigantic crash, and it's on the way very soon, and Britain is fucked. So I don't know what the crap's going on, but they've
An economic
basically,
crash.
yeah, they've done slight concessions on certain things, but overall, it's like they're just not taxing the rich as such. They're doing a mansion tax, which is not much, but they are taxing the plebs who are already getting fucked over by getting low wages and stuff. So,
Hmm.
and the thing is, they promised not to tax the plebs because everyone is saying, "How are you going to do this without taxing the people?" They're going, "Oh,
Indeed.
we're not going to," and then they have obviously because without taxing the rich, that's the only way it's going to happen. Weirdly enough, we've got a group of billionaires in Britain who are actually asking them to force the rich to pay more tax, and they won't. They just won't. They just will not. It's a group of them. They're like they go around in a bus
Well,
saying, "We're
well,
saying tax, tax the rich bus," and
well,
they all.
they've been moving their capital offshore,
Hmm.
and so why, come and get it. I guess that's kind of, come and take it.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, and that's kind of the thing that the Russians are doing. A lot of the Russians have a significant amount. In fact, they're probably the biggest proportional thing is all their holdings of all their oligarchy are all held offshore or outside of Russia.
I think that may be, 'cause I've been thinking about this, the whole shock doctrine malarkey.